Welcome to Boston Jewish Now, a JCRC of Greater Boston podcast, and we are recording on Monday, May 18th. We often talk at JCRC, including on this podcast, about what it takes to sustain a healthy civic society and a creed-based pluralistic democracy. That includes the ability to hold disagreement, even deep disagreement, with civility, to commit ourselves to a sense of personal civic responsibility to the common good. But where and how are these behaviors and attitudes taught? How do we help people learn to argue seriously, listen respectfully, and stay in relationship across difference? Where should we expect people to learn to live alongside those whose beliefs and commitments are different from their own? Some would argue that the highest priority of a good education is to prepare students with the technical skills for careers, and certainly that is important. But I suspect that today's guest would argue that education itself is in service to a healthy civic modality, that our universities should help form the kind of people a pluralistic society depends on, people who can think carefully, ask better questions, and hold convictions without losing the ability to listen. And at a moment when so many people are talking about the future of higher education, and, as well, the challenges many in our Jewish community are personally experiencing on campus, our guest today has been asking, what is a college education actually supposed to form within a person beyond preparing them for a career? I'm very pleased to welcome today's guest, Dr. Greg Weiner, to unpack that and more with us. Dr. Weiner is the president of Assumption University, a Catholic university founded by the Augustinians and located in Worcester, Massachusetts. He is a scholar of American political thought and has spent much of his career thinking and writing about constitutionalism, civic life, and the responsibilities of democratic citizenship, something that we at JCRC think a great deal about. And, interestingly, Dr. Weiner is also the president of Congregation Beth Israel in Worcester, which is to say that he brings a unique perspective to this conversation as the first Jewish president of a Catholic university in the United States. Dr. Weiner, welcome to Boston Jewish Now.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
So before we get into some of the things you've been writing about over the past year or two related to higher education and the role in civic society, I'd love for our audience to get to know a little bit more about you as a person. You didn't start your career as the head of a college. You were, like myself, someone who was in Democratic Party political communications at the time. So tell us a little bit about your background and career.
I started my career at a small-town newspaper in Texas, which is where I grew up, because a professor at the University of Texas at Austin had told me, if you want to learn how to write, go to a small-town newspaper where you'll be writing about everything. And I worked there for a year and a half, and decided I wanted to work in politics. I moved to D.C. in a Mitsubishi van.
Okay.
Without a job lined up, and started knocking on doors, and ended up working for several years for Senator Bob Kerrey of Nebraska, and then was consulting for several years beyond that.
You've also written about and studied some of what are considered to be the great liberals in the Democratic tradition, particularly Daniel Patrick Moynihan, the longtime senator from New York. Where does this, what have you learned about or thought about with regard to that role of the classic liberal society in our American politics?
Moynihan is a wonderful exemplar of a lot of liberal virtues, but also a lot of the tensions that the Democratic Party is dealing with now. He was, to his core, a New Deal liberal who thought that government had enormous power to do good. Where he thought the 1960s and the Great Society went awry is when they were trying to re-engineer society rather than say that poverty was an evil that government had the power to combat. Very much, as you know, a champion of Israel, and I think a bit misunderstood as a liberal Cold Warrior, but certainly someone who was a great proponent of freedom in our world.
Okay. love to explore a little bit, just like get our audience to understand you and your thinking and sort of how you came to all of this. After you were in politics, you also became a political scientist, or what was the sequence there? And you've done a great deal of writing about some of the founders, and would love for you to share some of that thinking with us.
Honestly, the sequence there was I was consulting in one of the typical trajectories as you drift from political consulting into corporate consulting, which I enjoyed, but it was getting boring and was not terribly stimulating intellectually. And I went back to graduate school and started taking classes at night, and one thing led to another, and I decided to to finish a PhD and embark on an academic career.
And so what has been interesting to you in the course of that academic career? And tell us a little bit about sort of the theses that you've been exploring over the course of your career.
One of the important things that I observed when I was working in politics was that there was this great divide, and it was really almost a divide of mutual contempt between people who lived in the world of ideas and people who lived in the world of action. So a lot of my scholarship has pertained to the political thought of practicing statesmen. And one of the things it's convinced me of is that ideas are important. At our commencement at Assumption yesterday, I was speaking to the students about this cliche that we have of college prepares you for the real world. The world of ideas is the real world. In fact, it's the only real world because it's the world that endures across change. So that motivated a lot of my thinking going into an academic career, has been part of a lot of my scholarship, and so is the idea of constitutionalism and civic life, particularly in the American experiment.
We're going to get more into the particulars of Assumption University and the ideas about the current college environment in a few minutes. But given that we are on the cusp of the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, and as you said, the ideas within the democratic political experiment, I know that you are known as a scholar of James Madison. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts to share about sort of what you see in his work as one of the founders, and what that idea is, what we should be rooting our conversation about that idea in right now.
Madison was a great proponent of constitutionalism, of the power of a written constitution, but also of the power of a written constitution to guide democratic debate, what he would have called Republican debate. He was a proponent of majority rule, but understood the importance of a written constitution in framing that, and particularly of the importance of not only a system of constitutionalism, but of the natural conditions that he observed in the forming American Republic, of patience and of the power of time to dissipate passions, and what I called in a book about Madison, temporal republicanism, the idea that the purpose of constitutional systems was to allow public opinion to be seasoned and mature and deliberate before it could take hold.
So can you say a little more about what this deliberation component is, and how did the founders understand the deliberative component of that public democracy?
Interestingly, for Madison, and needless to say, the founders lived at many more steps of removed from immediate public scrutiny than we do. But in many ways, for Madison, time was the point. He felt that, observed, I would say, that in a democracy, the majority always gets its way sooner or later, and as he felt it should. And the important function of deliberation was giving time for public passions to cool, to be what in his phrase, refined and enlarged by constitutional actors. So the virtuous representative, and I was stumbling there because I was trying not to say virtuous, because there was a great debate on how much virtue Madison wanted to rely on. Their role was to act in some ways as a break, as a pause, but to say, do you want to stop and think about that for a minute? I've compared constitutionalism to Odysseus having himself tied to the mast.
Okay.
So to give that pause for delay, and he thought the delay actually normally would allow the best of the public of the majority to take hold. And in fact, if you don't believe that, he often said, your quarrel is really with democracy itself.
Mm-hmm. I'm listening to you, and I'm going to go off a tangent slightly, but I realize it's two Jews sitting here in Boston right now, and you're talking about the tempering that comes through that debate. That we're in a moment where the longtime Jewish congressman from Massachusetts, Barney Frank, is in hospice and has been giving a number of interviews where he has been talking about the tempering and the pace of change in the political system. And I'm wondering if you have been following any of his recent interviews and if you have any thoughts about that particular topic that he seems so determined to leave a legacy on.
I have followed it a bit. It reminded me, the interview that he gave to the Boston Globe, of something that Moynihan once wrote, which is that the pace of social change always moves too slowly from the perspective of the person seeking it. But there is one of the purposes of constitutionalism is to provide a vehicle for building consensus. And when I used to teach Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, which is quite emphatic that you should disobey unjust laws, I used to compare that with Lincoln's what's called his Lyceum address, in which he says that one must always obey the law. He calls it a civic religion. And the comparison I tried to draw for students is that a republic needs both of those perspectives. It needs a theory of governing and a theory of protest.
And how does one balance those two theories?
One hopes that people are pushing the system from a variety of perspectives, but also that there's enough distance and reflection from those acting within the system and to temper those views and ensure that there's consensus built for change. Lincoln was known in his time as a moderate or even as a conservative Republican because he felt that it was important to build consensus, public consensus around an end to chattel slavery.
So, if I'm hearing you correctly, the things that Congressman Frank is talking about right now are very much in the tradition of Lincoln and Madison and others.
Building consensus for change.
Building consensus for change.
Certainly is.
Okay. Yes. This is like a bit of a hard pivot, but since you brought up civic religion, and we do want to talk about some things that are going on campus today, before we get there, how does a Jewish kid from Texas end up being the head of a Catholic university in Worcester?
I'm trying to remember myself, but I think there's actually a very natural explanation for that. There's a lot that Jews and Catholics hold in common in terms of disposition. Needless to say, there's some very foundational theological differences. But both are traditions that value education a great deal, that have accumulated over the years a great deal of commentary and serious intellectual conversation. Both the intellectual traditions, I think, have a lot of similarities, both in terms of the value of intellect, but also the dialogue between faith and reason. I think there are also a lot of commonalities in worship, again, without papering over the fundamental differences, but the bodily aspect of ritual, the physical aspect of ritual, one can feel, I think, in a very natural way in a Catholic space.
I'm curious, and I know you've written about this, sort of the way in which the Catholic tradition and the Jewish tradition approach education or learning. What do you see as the commonalities there?
The commonalities there are a respect for two things.
Mm-hmm.
One is the power of the human intellect and the responsibility, in fact, of the human intellect, and the fact that we're made in the image of God and the capacity of reason that entails. But also both traditions, I think, have a very deep understanding of the limits of human intellect. And that's where faith comes in the Catholic tradition, that's called mystery. And those two exist in a very fruitful dialogue. And the Catholic Church and the Jewish tradition, the rabbinic tradition, the tradition of commentary and conversation and dispute, I think have been operating, obviously leading toward very different conclusions, but valuing those two things is very much natural to both traditions.
So I'm going to prompt you a little bit with some of your own quote. I'm going to quote you back at you to see if we can get a little more spice on that point, I guess, because you wrote in the Catholic Free Press in making the argument that Catholic education can combat anti-Semitism, that moral certainty is antithetical to education, but indispensable to indoctrination. And I would love for you to expand on this question of moral certainty in the Catholic tradition, the Jewish tradition, and how you're thinking about bringing that together in your argument about the role of the Catholic university in the modern sense.
I've often said that if our graduates leave Assumption with nothing other than an appreciation for nuance and the habits of judgment to deal with it, then we've succeeded. There are moral certainties in life, but most of political life doesn't operate within areas of black and white. That's not to say there aren't areas of black and white. It's to say that one can't apply, and Edmund Burke would have said this, who I've written a great deal about, that one can't apply mathematical formulas to political life. Political life is complicated. It's messy. It involves people learning to get along with one another, learning to interpret, as the New Testament says, to look at the world through a glass darkly, and to understand that things are often opaque and obscure, and we can have ultimate commitments, but in the messiness of day-to-day life, we have to sort those out with one another.
So I'm curious, you said something just now that prompts so many observations for me. You described it as the New Testament. And I do a lot of work with Christian leaders, taking them to Israel, and we're very conscious to always reference to it, the Christian Bible. And even some of my Christian pastor friends will throw back, it's not the New Testament because there's a whole theology around that language. And yet you are, to the point of this conversation, you are the head of a Catholic university. I'm curious how you navigate some of that sort of Jewish and Christian language and understanding around Christian teaching, and the choice to use that framework of New Testament it invites curiosity for me about your role as a Jewish leader in a very, very Catholic space.
It's interesting. Catholics would probably refer to the gospel, to the Christian Bible also makes sense. I actually, Catholics at Assumption sometimes say the Old Testament and then almost rush in to apologize. I actually was never sensitive to that distinction before then. I think the role of being a Jewish president at a Catholic university is language becomes very important, because in many ways you're a guest in someone else's home. I have tried to work Catholic teaching, often scriptural quotes. Our university is very much animated by the charism of St. Augustine. To work those into my language about education, but never in a way that suggests I'm somehow being performatively Catholic. I have participated when invited in worship services that occasionally when there is a reading from the Torah, they've been asked to read it in Hebrew before. But I am always very careful, out of respect and out of my own convictions, not to participate in a way that suggests that I'm endorsing religious views that it's clear I don't hold.
It's very interesting. I'm deeply intrigued by this idea of leading an institution that is fostering, by design and intent, an Augustinian worldview that, while not necessarily in conflict with one's own views, is a different tradition from your own.
It's really a different tradition. There are also different kinds of Catholic universities. So Ex Cordia Ecclesiae, the apostolic constitution that John Paul II wrote for Catholic universities, says that it's important that these institutions be both Catholic and a university, which is to say that Catholic universities are Catholic institutions. They are ministries of the Catholic Church, and as institutions operate in accordance with church teaching. But a Catholic university is also a different kind of organization from another kind of Catholic organization, a Catholic hospital, a Catholic charity, a Catholic parish, and so forth. Within the realm of Catholic universities, which I've heard described as the place where the church does its thinking, there are also different traditions. There are different kinds of Catholic universities. I think one reason that I feel so at home at Assumption is that we interpret and express our Catholic identity in terms of the nature of the education that we're providing, not in terms of monitoring people's religious observance. Not that the university isn't interested in that, but our primary vehicle for expressing our Catholic identity is through a certain tradition of education.
So let's talk about what is that tradition of education? What is the nature of the education within the Catholic University, and in particular at Assumption?
It's rooted in the Catholic intellectual tradition. So all of our students go through what we call the Foundations program. It starts with what we call cornerstone courses in theology, in philosophy, as well as in English, and expands outward from there. Every student takes that, including in programs like nursing, where the curriculum is often very rigidly structured because of licensure requirements. And it forms a common intellectual experience for the students. One of the teachings of the Catholic Church and the traditions, I would say, of Catholic education is that truth and beauty and goodness can be expressed in any number of ways and should be contemplated and appreciated and received and explored wherever they're found. So it's easy to think of a Catholic university as like any other university except there's a chapel on campus, or like any other university except there's a requirement to take a theology class. Those things are true, except that the Catholic educational tradition teaches us that the beauty, the created order is a gift, I think very compatible with a Jewish view, and that we receive and appreciate that gift by looking for truth wherever it is to be found. And that means that it might be in a chemistry lab, it might be in a nursing course, it might be in a social science, and certainly is to be found in the great works of the Western canon as well.
So we're having this conversation at a time where there's been a lot of discussion about the university in America. And as I said in the opening, clearly a conversation about where Jews belong in the great institutions of higher education in our country, as well as, to be blunt about it, a very aggressive intervention by the federal government in the university space. What should be taught, how it should be taught, what should be allowed on campus. I would love to know how you see the Catholic university tradition as informing the larger discourse on this topic.
It's interesting, in the spring of 2024, when encampments were spreading and anti-Semitism was erupting, the elite campuses got most of the attention, but the reality this was at regional state universities around the country. That in many ways was the more haunting aspect of it, was how pervasive it was throughout higher education. Most Catholic universities did not have an issue. And I would say that the more seriously they took their Catholic identity, the less of an issue with anti-Semitism they had. And the reason is that Catholic universities are focused on education, which is what the university is fundamentally about. And at some point, I'm not a historian of higher education and couldn't pinpoint exactly when, but at some point we've developed the idea that even with respect to the university's duty to form habits of citizenship, that somehow that is to be expressed and contemplated through the discussion of current events. In a classical sense, liberal education is actually defined by a retreat from the immediate to focus on the enduring. And I think that is the most important contribution that Catholic universities are making to this moment.
What are the habits that you're thinking about in terms of this civic discourse?
Of citizenship?
And citizenship.
I think they are the habits of deliberation. They're also the habits of friendship, and a particular kind of friendship, so the friendship of citizens, civic friendship, as we call it at Assumption. To live in community with other people is to know that you don't get to have everything that you want. You accommodate yourself to. We all know this, living in a home with other people. Mm-hmm. And there is a certain the humility that is involved in that, and the ability to accommodate oneself to the views and the needs of others. There's a disposition there of humility, but there is also a need for courage. for the willingness to state one's views and to push back where one sees something wrong. I think those capacities, and I describe these as the virtues associated with learning as well, humility, courage, and charity, are not developed by someone standing in front of a classroom and saying, now let me tell you what humility is, and here's how to be humble as a citizen. It is an experience of encounter with literature, with the great works of political thought, but also philosophy in general, with theological thinking. It's also an experience we have on campus every day in the sense that students' first experience of citizenship is often living in a residence hall and realizing that one person's desire to play music at night at a certain volume may conflict with another's desire to sleep or to study or to get up in the morning to go to an athletic practice. And we learn to accommodate ourselves, not simply to insist on the I as the ultimately authoritative individual. It's you develop a clear understanding through that experience that we all live in a community.
I want to come back to the larger conversation about higher education in America in a moment. But first, since you referenced it, I want to stay with this issue of friendship. And I know that at Assumption, you started a Center for Civic Friendship in 2024. Can you tell us a little bit about sort of what that center is designed to do and how that work came about?
There was a spreading of, it still is a spreading of very good centers for civil discourse, for free speech, for the open expression of ideas on campus, and those are crucially necessary. You can't have citizenship if you can't talk with one another. But we felt there was something missing there, that simply to focus on civil discourse could be to, instead of shouting at each other across a unbridgeable divide, we're being polite to each other across an unbridgeable divide. The question of civic friendship was, how do we make conversation not only polite but also productive? And the answer to that was to say the friendship of citizens is a particular kind of friendship, and it's a friendship that is rooted in common aims, in the trust that comes with being committed to the same things, and therefore saying, I encourage you to disagree with me, because we're both trying to accomplish the same thing, and we trust each other for that reason.
Because we're talking about in a sort of a civic container, what are those common things, and how I guess I would say, how granular do they need to be? Is it as simple as the common aims of a pluralistic democratic America, or does it have to be more granular? And and I ask this in the sense of, for example, knowing that in our partnerships that we have with the Catholic Church, there are, each of our communities has deep commitments, and there are some things that we deeply disagree about. And I've certainly, I say this only half jokingly, some of the hardest moments of my career here have been when having a difficult conversation with the cardinal about differences over, say, reproductive health and justice issues versus like immigration issues where we have deep alignment, but there's deep disalignment between the Jewish community, the Catholic Church, and other parts of American society. So this question of civic friendship and the question of these ideas, how granular does one need to go?
For purposes of civic friendship in a large society, so at a national level, I think one can't be terribly granular because those fundamental disagreements are inevitable, and they're perfectly appropriate to have. One of the bases, I think, of sharing common ends is the willingness to debate about what the common ends are and the ability to debate what the common ends are. I think that can take any number of forms in a republic the size of the United States. It can take. We share certain constitutional commitments. I think the best expression of this is at the end of Lincoln's first inaugural, where he talks about the past that we share in common. And if you talk with a historian, they will tell you quite accurately, we argue about the past. We argue about what it means. To me, that's very similar to the Talmudic tradition of we're arguing about what the text means, but we all agree there's a text that is binding and that holds some sacred status. So when Lincoln closes that with the references to the memory of every patriot grave and so forth, I think simply knowing that whether we became citizens yesterday or our ancestors arrived on the Mayflower, that there is something we share in common in a past to which we owe respect and a future we're trying to achieve together. I think even at that very broad level, there's something to be friends about, and there's something to say. There's some basis for saying you and I disagree about some aspect of the American past, but in this 250th year of American freedom, we think there's something special there. We think there's something worth holding sacred, even as we disagree about what exactly it means.
Yeah, I do wonder if some of those arguments about the past and the truths we hold are becoming too far apart, or maybe we are too big a democracy in the way that maybe Madison and others never imagined. And certainly, we're in this 250th anniversary, and there was a fair amount of disagreement about whether America was founded, say, as a Christian nation or as a theist nation. And those have deep political implications in our current politics. At what point do alternative narratives of the history become too wide a schism to hold in friendship?
I think we start going down that road the moment that we think the purpose of interpreting history is to read today back into the past, to read our current views, our current agenda, and interpretation of what's happening around us now into the past, as opposed to saying what Lincoln said in the Cooper Union Address, which is he lays out a case that the founding generation was uniformly opposed to enslavement. And he closes it by saying, I want to make sure I'm not misunderstood on one point. I'm not saying we should blindly follow in what the founding fathers said. But when we do disagree, it should be, I'm not quoting him here, but from a position of respect, a disposition of respect, a belief that there is something there that is worth holding on to and that deserves a certain degree of deference.
Okay, thank you. I'm sure I know we could easily talk. I have a gazillion questions to explore this question of America's past, present, and the story we tell ourselves. And I'm mindful that you've several times come back to the writings and the words of Lincoln, who probably more than any individual in the story of the nation gave new meaning and interpretation to the founders, which sort of begs the question of what do we do now to reimagine, or may not reimagine, but to offer new vibrancy and interpretation to the founders' words. And I wonder what thoughts you have about sort of like this moment of rejuvenating the founders.
Edmund Burke distinguishes between revolution and reform.
Okay.
And he says the difference is the purpose of a revolution is to tear everything down and build anew. He provides at the end of his reflections on the revolution in France a set of criteria for constitutional reform. And he says, even when I reformed, it would be in order to conserve. If we can agree that there is something worth conserving, there are some basic values, there are others about which we disagree, that there's something basically worth conserving about this experience that we've had together, that some of us have inherited earlier or later in the game than others. I think that's the beginning of bridging these divides. What perpetuates those divides is the insistence on both the right and the left in holding others in contempt. And there are two basic pathologies in American politics today. One is if you disagree with me, you're immoral. And the other is if you disagree with me, you're stupid. Neither of those is terribly persuasive, and both ends of the political spectrum tend to tap into them at different times.
Certainly no one should ever change my mind by telling me I was either immoral or stupid.
Or immoral or stupidly immoral.
And I should say people tell me that pretty much every week.
Right. You can't be a good citizen while holding half of your fellow citizens in contempt. It just doesn't work. Mm-hmm. We could disagree strongly about views, but when I referred before to courage, humility, and charity, the charity is listening for what others are trying to say, not listening for what will set you off or generate outrage or clicks or offense, but genuinely trying to listen to what someone else has to say And the humility part of that is the belief that which is essential, utterly essential to a pluralistic society, that I might be wrong. So even if you and I disagree on the most fundamental things, I should be listening for something I can learn from you.
So that takes us back more specifically to the conversation about higher education in this moment, and then to the argument that you have made about Catholic universities and potentially Jewish students. But before we get to the specifics of Catholic universities and Jewish students, I want to look at the larger higher education space and draw from what you just said into the conversation. And you have written and said publicly that you believe that even as some of our institutions of higher ed here in Massachusetts have come under deep assault and intervention from the federal government, that there is also some self-criticism that needs to happen there. Can you speak a little more to what you see as the flaws in the current state of higher education?
Trust in higher education has been plummeting, and plummeting is the right word, for at least a decade, for a variety of reasons, including cost, perception of cost, including, I think, a very valid concern about political bias, regardless of which of those political views I do or don't share. And what's happened in the last couple of years is a mythology has taken hold that everything was going fine and there were no problems on any campuses anywhere. And then suddenly a new administration came in and everything went haywire. The professions are a unique aspect of American society. They are an aspect of what Tocqueville called civil society, that essential middle space between the individual and the government. What's unique about the professions in America is they're largely self-regulating. And if we can't ask hard questions of ourselves, we should not be surprised when others impose answers. I don't like I oppose the imposition of those answers. It doesn't excuse us from the burden of self-reflection.
With that caveat of opposing outside interventions, what should that self-reflection be in this moment?
I don't oppose all outside interventions. Okay. I think attempts to dictate what happens in the classroom, what can or can't be said, what curricula look like, and so forth. Those are real problems because the muscle memory almost of civil society begins to atrophy. If this is the Catholic doctrine of subsidiarity, by the way, the decision should be made at by the authority closest to the individual in order to preserve those and nourish those intermediate spaces. Anyone who thinks there was not a free speech problem on campuses, I think is fooling themselves. We might argue about which campuses had problems from which direction. That's all fair game. But the idea that there was no issue with bias, there was no issue with people feeling they couldn't express themselves, it's ridiculous. It's absurd, and I think, by the way, we all know it's absurd. So let's talk about it. Let's get it out into the open. And I think this is carefully closely related to this mythology that in the spring of 2024, anti-Semitism was created out of nothing, simply appeared on college campuses, and then as soon as there were regulatory incentives in place, somehow it simply vanished. That it was this effervescent, sudden explosion out of nowhere that just simply went away. It was reflective of a deep, deep problem on American campuses that I would argue persists.
So what would you say is that deep, deep problem that the anti-Semitism that was more explicitly visible after October 7th, what would you say was that deep, deep problem?
The anti-Semitism is, of course, a problem in itself, and I think was unquestionably present. There's a broader problem that has to do with what higher education is about. And I think it is encapsulated by a sign I saw at one of the, I think it was Columbia encampments, but in one of the pieces of news coverage. It was someone holding up a sign saying, "Why did we read Edward Said if we're not going to use it?" Now, I'm not a fan of Edward Said, an important figure in literary criticism and should be read. The key there was use it. as though ideas were not something to discuss, to contemplate, to appreciate, to challenge, to explore, but their value was to be measured only by their utility, only by the way that one could apply them to something else. And American higher education has been walking into this trap for well over a century by describing and allowing education to be reduced to transactional terms, to say that it's all about return on investment. It's all about doing this in order to do that, in order to do something else. Those are all very important. We've lost something about the intrinsic value of education. And as soon as we begin saying the university is about current events, or the ideas that are explored at a university are measured by how they're applied or their transactional value, we're in trouble. And the fact that universities genuinely operate in something of an echo chamber, I think, accentuates that.
Okay. I'm curious how you see the way out of that in the university environment. What would change, and what would change look like?
I think the rejuvenation of American higher education is going to begin at institutions like Assumption.
Okay.
Not just Assumption, I'm not being entirely self-serving here, but there are institutions that are sufficiently steeped in, I would say, rotted away in practices, in ideological beliefs, and in anti-Semitic beliefs that I think Jews in particular should be thinking about who shares our educational values. I've written before that when Jews were not allowed into country clubs, we didn't grovel at the gate saying, "Would it be okay with you if we came in and would you please like us?" We built JCCs. Mm-hmm. And I think small Catholic institutions like Assumption, don't have to be, not all Catholic, but the smaller institutions that are serious about education, mm-hmm. not about liberal education as a good in itself, are the ones that reflect our educational values and are where that rebuilding should begin.
And so this leads to your argument that more Jewish students should be going to Catholic universities because of this alignment around a humility of learning, the approach to questioning and curiosity.
And the intrinsic value of learning. One of the arguments I hear from Jewish friends a fair amount is a fear that the students are, if they go to a Catholic university, are going to be evangelized in mm-hmm. some way. That's not what Catholic education is about. Again, not to say that it's disinterested in religious observance, but it's fundamentally about education and about trusting the individual to absorb ideas and seek truth and seek beauty and goodness and reach their own conclusions. I would also argue there's a certain amount of evangelism that's clearly happening at other institutions. It just happens to be of a secular variety and often a hateful variety. Mm-hmm. I do think it is generally true that people who take religion seriously, and I am no one's idea of the Tzaddik Hador. And were I a Catholic, I would be on no one's short list for
which should translate for the sake of our audience. You mean the sort of the righteous of a generation in Hebrew,
right? But people who take religion seriously as something to be dealt with seriously, even across religious difference, I think understand one another in a way that is much closer, that is much more bridgeable chasm than the secular and the religious worlds.
I hear that, and I recognize your argument that there's a lot that a Jewish student could benefit and grow in a Catholic university in a way that the kind of, to your word, evangelism that is going on in some of our highest, most prominent institutions of higher ed, there's a different kind of evangelism going on there that is not necessarily beneficial to developing the next generation of civic stakeholders. I also want to ask you, is there a danger or a challenge in withdrawing from that space? And certainly we as American Jews, as you said, when we were kept out of certain spaces, we built our own. And obviously, right here in Massachusetts, for example, Brandeis University was created in part for American Jews who were being kept out of the Ivy League to go someplace else. And yet we also take a lot of pride as a community in how far we've come.
Sure.
And if we were to withdraw from that space, and it's clearly no family, no individual youth making a decision about college has to be the bastion on behalf of an entire people or an entire approach to civic education. But if we make that decision to encourage withdrawal from that space, are we going to end up leaving our society worse off than it is now?
I would say a couple things in response to that. One is what I said about nuance before pertains. And one of the most frustrating things about the conversation about higher education over the last few years has been the very small number of institutions that suck up about 98% of the oxygen. If you put all the Ivy League institutions together, they are educating a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of American students going to college. So there's a great middle space there. There are also great Ivy League institutions. I'm not trying to paint them all with a single brush. There is also a certain point at which I think we as Jews have to ask ourselves, what is it that we value about our ability to get into these institutions? When we fought to get into these institutions, was it the education that we valued or was it the pedigree? Because if it's simply the pedigree, then I think we have to ask, does that reflect our educational values? Particularly if it has to come at the cost of children, our children, again, being evangelized to despise their own past and their own people.
I really appreciate that choice of terms, the pedigree, and this question coming to this from a place of as a Jewish community and as Jewish communities that have prized education and knowledge, and you referenced, going back farther even than the Talmud, this question of what we want out of education and this question of pedigree. It's very helpful for me to hear you frame that critique in that way. And what I hear you arguing is essentially that we as Jews have a history of prizing critical thinking and critical education and the questioning and the curiosity. And we should be choosing to invest in and send our children to those institutions that share that commitment.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think we can see this a little more clearly if we simply ask, why read a page of Talmud today? Which I have not done today, by the way.
Okay.
Because what you'll read are...
Not Tzaddik Ador.
Correct.
Forgive it.
Correct. What you'll read are what seem on the surface of it to be highly legalistic debates about is this particular oven kosher, or who owns this ox in this transaction. That's worth studying if we think there's something intrinsically beautiful and even in the case of the Talmud, even sacred about those arguments. If the only purpose of education is transactional, is to you go to pick your conventional elite institution, you go there for 4 years simply to make the right contacts so that you get the right job or get into the right professional school or whatever it might be. There's certainly a role for that. And it's certainly easy for me to sit here and say, if you've worked your whole life to work hard, genuinely hard, your whole life, to either afford for your children or for your children to get into a very elite institution, it's very easy for me to say, well, maybe we need to take a step back from that. I do think we have to confront the fact that if it's purely transactional, that's fine, but there's a cost there, and it's not. It also doesn't reflect our educational values.
I'm very intrigued by this entire framework of thinking about where our interests are, both in terms of education specifically, and maybe you're raising something even bigger about the interests of the Jewish community in fostering an approach to civics and the kinds of universities that actually engage in the kinds of friendship approach that you are talking about, that we actually have a collective interest in a different approach to our discourse about higher ed.
I think that's right, and I think again there are. I'm not saying to give up on any one institution or set of institutions, and again the vast majority of American college students and the vast majority of Jewish American college students are not at the top. Pick your however many spaces you want to go down in the U.S. News rankings. So I'm certainly not suggesting that Jews should withdraw from that space, but we have choices to make within that space. And those choices should reflect, I think, our educational value, but also our sense of pride about where we feel welcome and valued, and where there are disagreements, where we believe they're taken up with respect, and there's a certain point at which I think there are institutions where you have to look at and say, actually, they don't want us there. They're not. It's not there was a spring of 24 that went off the rails. There are places where we're not welcome, and I don't think we should be groveling to feel welcome there. I think we should be building spaces where we are welcome and where we are part of a larger society.
So you've been very generous with your time, and I want to thank you for that. And you've certainly given us a lot to think about and talk about, both with regard to the larger conversation about education, civics, where it gets fostered, what we're trying to achieve, as well as in this 250th anniversary that we're headed into, and people are going to be listening to this just weeks ahead of July 4th, I imagine. I want to wrap up by, first of all, asking you, what is giving you hope about the project of Civic Space right now?
Young people who are going to college as they are at Assumption with their priorities straight, who are, I tell parents often that there are two reasons to go to college. One is that you know everything and you want to shout it at the world. You can do that for free. The other is that there are things you don't know and you want to learn them. And I see that every day. The students at places like Assumption are profoundly teachable. They are full of wonder. They disagree with each other. They make mistakes. They get up and keep going. They have grit and determination, and they lack entitlement. And there is nothing about a long day of meetings that 5 minutes with this generation of students won't fix. So if we can focus on these students, not simply the ones who are in the news at any given moment or involved in any particular controversy, that is very much a reason for hope.
So less shouting and more curiosity.
More curiosity, and what comes with curiosity is humility.
And humility. That is a great place to wrap up this conversation. I mean, so I am curious. I understand you're working on another book on the question of power and politics and the limits on that. Can you tell us a little bit about what's going to be in that book?
Sure. There is a difference that I think is very much pertinent to our current divides between principles that have limits and principles that are illimitable. An illimitable principle of one of which there's more is always better than less. And when that's the case, whether it's you might call it progress on the left, a certain form of nostalgia on the right, whatever it might be, it becomes some combination of irrational and immoral to compromise and to listen and to arrive at common ground. Limitable principles are ones that bump up against each other, that have to accommodate themselves to each other, and that are adaptable to difference, to a large pluralistic society. And there's a conflict, an awareness of the difference between those kinds of principles that goes back to the ancient world and before, and continues to be with us today.
Well, unfortunately, our time is limited today. So hopefully maybe when we have the opportunity to read this book, we'll have you come back to talk about these ideas some more.
I hope so.
Thank you again, Dr. Greg Weiner of Assumption University, for being with us today on Boston Jewish Now.
Thank you very much.